That's wonderful. Great. Wonderful to see so many people. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to talk to you, and especially such a wide range of people in the audience. I think I saw someone from Poland. I think I saw someone with an MBE, trauma network manager. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you. My name is Gordon Fuller. I'm an emergency medicine consultant at the Northern General Major Trauma Centre in Sheffield. I'm also a researcher at the University of Sheffield and was the chief investigator for the MATTS study. Which was the major trauma triage study. I'm also joined by Josh Miller, who's one of the senior paramedics from West Midlands Ambulance Service and was a co-investigator on the MATTS project. MATTS was a National Institute of Health Research funded study that aimed to develop a standardized national major trauma triage tool with the ultimate aim of getting the right injured patient to the right place at the right time. I'm going to discuss some of the background to major trauma triage and the development and evaluation of the new MATTS triage tool. And I'm going to hand over the baton to Josh, who'll go through the tool in a bit more finer detail and also discuss some operational aspects of its use and implementation. And just before I start, just a big thank you to everybody who was involved in the MATTS project. These types of big research projects really are a collaborative effort. So big thank you to the rest of the MATTS research team. Big thank you to the participating ambulance services, SWAST, LAS, West Midlands and Yorkshire. Big thank you to all the participating trauma networks. And finally, a big thank you to TARN as well, who were very, very helpful to us in data collection. So, major trauma networks were introduced in England back in 2011 in London to begin with, to coordinate and direct the care for seriously injured patients across pre-hospital services, hospitals receiving trauma admissions and rehabilitation services. And their aim is to ensure that patients injured within a specific defined geographical area, their need is matched to a care pathway that meets that need. They consist of a central major trauma centre hospital, which provides specialist resuscitation, definitive care, rehabilitation to the high security and most seriously injured patients. Peripheral trauma units manage lower acuity and less seriously injured patients and can provide stabilisation, initial management and transfer of more seriously injured patients to an MTC if appropriate or needed. And then there's also some local emergency hospitals, which are acute hospitals, but don't routinely manage significantly injured patients. And trauma networks have subsequently been introduced across the UK in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and most recently in Wales. Now, ambulance services see a lot of injured patients every week, but only a small number of those actually have major trauma, and the identification of those patients with major trauma isn't always obvious at the scene. We clearly just can't transport every injured patient to the major trauma centre just in case. And in accordance with NICE major trauma service delivery guidelines, NHS ambulance services use pre-hospital triage tools to identify patients with major trauma and determine the appropriate destination, which if they've got major trauma will be an MTC. However, NICE noted that there was wide variability in the triage tools used across NHS trauma networks and recommended some research to develop a national tool. And that's the reason and history behind the MATTS project being commissioned. So the MATTS project consisted of 3 phases. Phase 1 was preparatory work to help develop a new optimal candidate triage tool, and it included a number of different work streams, and those included an analysis of all the existing triage tools we could find in the UK and internationally, a review of the existing evidence base into major trauma triage, a new systematic review looking at elderly major trauma triage, which was a gap in the evidence base, some economic and operational modelling of major trauma triage to see exactly how we want our triage tool to work, to define a new definition of major trauma, and then some surveys and focus groups, qualitative research to investigate what's happening currently in major trauma triage, what's working, what isn't working. And then finally, based on all of that preceding work, to develop a new triage tool through expert consensus. We then took that triage tool and all of the other or most of the other triage tools we'd identified during phase 1. And in phase 2, we performed a diagnostic case cohort study where we validated those triage tools, compared their accuracy, and had a look at which one performed the best. We took the best performing tool, apparently from phase 2, and then we implemented it into trauma networks and evaluated it and studied how it worked. And in parallel to that, in phase 3, we also performed an economic evaluation to make sure that the triage tool was cost effective. And we performed some further qualitative research to see, was the triage tool acceptable? How was it received? Was it working as intended? So what we'll do now is go through 10 important issues and questions related to major trauma triage, and we'll highlight the findings of the MATTS project at each stage of those. So number 1, do we need to develop, or was there a need to develop a new triage tool? Well, there's several systematic reviews that had a look at all of the studies that have looked at major trauma triage tools globally throughout the world and how accurate they are. And unfortunately, they show that there's generally low quality supporting evidence for most tools. There wasn't any UK data, and at face value, triage tool accuracy appeared to be suboptimal. There were 2 reasonably good studies, one in America by New Guard, who looked at the American College of Surgeons field triage decision tool, and they reported a sensitivity of 66% and a specificity of 87% for their triage tool, and they studied about 50,000 patients. There was another research group in Holland, in the Netherlands, Voskins and colleagues. They looked at 5,000 injured Dutch patients, and they evaluated their Dutch field triage protocol, and that showed also disappointing sensitivity of 36% and specificity of 92%. Our systematic review that we performed in elderly patients showed similar findings, really, poor quality studies, no UK data, and what looked like low accuracy in current triage tools. We also, in phase 1, conducted an analysis of all published international tools and UK tools, and there's a lot of them, like well over 50, and there was 170 different variables used within the triage tools. And just looking within the UK, there was a wide variety of tools, each ambulance service using a different triage tool, and they varied, and you could categorize them into three groups, really. One end of the spectrum, there were very more specific tools. These had fewer variables, tighter cut points or thresholds, didn't really allow clinician judgment. And I think I saw the East of England Trauma Network manager on the chat, and that's an example of the historical or may even be current East of England triage tool on the bottom left there. At the other end of the spectrum, there were some ambulance services using more sensitive tools with more variables, more liberal cut points, senior support in there, structured clinical judgment in there, and the old Yorkshire Ambulance Service tool would be an example of that. So taken together, we can see there was a wide range of tools across the NHS. They hadn't been validated. Tools which had been validated elsewhere had low accuracy, and we didn't really know whether we wanted to go for a specific tool or a sensitive tool. And that provided a really clear rationale for carrying on with the MATTS project. So our second triage issue is a fundamental one. What are triage tools actually for? So we've said we want to get the right patient to the right place at the right time, and triage tools are the sort of key or central intervention within trauma networks to distribute where patients go. And they've got 2 potential roles. For patients that are injured closest to a trauma unit or a local emergency hospital, the triage tool can be used to select those patients for bypass to a distant specialist major trauma centre. They've also got a second role in that a positive triage tool result would result in pre-alerting the emergency department, who could then activate a hospital trauma team. And that second role is also relevant for patients injured closest to the major trauma centre. So we can't bypass those patients because they're always going to the major trauma centre. But if the triage tool is positive, then we can give a pre-alert to the emergency department. We do need to be aware of a couple of things related to that. So ambulance service clinicians might overrule what the triage tool is theoretically or objectively telling them to do. So, for example, a patient may have a raised respiratory rate, which might trigger a triage tool, but you could perhaps use your clinical judgment to say, okay, they've got COPD, so they've got a normally raised respiratory rate, and not bypass or pre-alert the patient. And alternatively, the patient might not meet any of the criteria in the triage tool, but you're worried about them, and they have, let's say, a very high energy mechanism of injury, and they're tachycardic or there's something else worrying, and that patient is bypassed or pre-alerted with the triage tool triggers all being negative. Also, patients that are pre-alerted through to the MTC, they might not accept the bypass, or they might accept the bypass but not bring the patient to resus, should bring them in through the normal entrance. So there's a little bit of nuance to how triage tools work. And within the MATTS project, our sort of primary outcome for the triage tool was a patient being transported to the major trauma centre and being pre-alerted. But we did look at some secondary things as well, whether the patient was taken to the MTC or not, and what the theoretical outcome of the tool was compared to what the paramedics or pre-hospital triage decision actually was. So thirdly, probably the most important issue for any major trauma triage tool is defining what patients we want that triage tool to pick out. Now, conventionally, triage tools have been designed to select patients with a pattern of serious anatomical injury, and that's normally been based around something called the injury severity score, which is a way of grading people's injuries and giving them a mark out of 76, I think it is. And normally it's been a threshold over 15 as counted as major trauma. However, what we really want to do is identify patients who would benefit from early specialist MTC care. So resuscitation by a hospital trauma team, or need a time critical trauma intervention like a life-saving operation or interventional radiology, not necessarily the severity of injury per se. And at the start of the MATTS project, using TARN data, we showed that about 10% of patients that required a life-saving intervention had a low injury severity score. So suggesting that that traditional measure wasn't perfect. And also there might be some patients who have a very high injury severity score, but actually taken to the major trauma centre isn't in their best interests. Let's say, for example, a patient with very advanced frailty or an end-of-life patient where supportive care closer to home, near relatives and community services would be more appropriate. So we therefore got the sort of great and the good of major trauma medicine together to develop a new reference standard or definition of major trauma through expert consensus. And that had a composite structure and consisted of 4 things. So firstly, patients who need a time critical intervention, major blood transfusion protocol, interventional radiology, something like that. Secondly, severe individual injuries, which might not meet that threshold of injury severity score greater than 15, but would be best managed in a major trauma centre. So, for example, multiple rib fractures with respiratory failure could be an example of that. Secondly, patients where there's a polytrauma patient, multiple injuries, which together provide a burden of injuries which benefit from expert MTC care. So that's similar to the traditional injury severity score greater than 15, although we have a few caveats around it. And then secondly, some patient or injury attributes that wouldn't benefit from MTC care. For example, an advanced directive saying they don't want to go to have advanced care. So the American College of Surgeons have published long-standing recommendations that major trauma triage tools should aim for a sensitivity of 95% and a specificity of between 65 and 75%. But we need to think, is that achievable and is it actually desirable? And we've already seen that existing tools appear to have limited accuracy and don't actually achieve these targets. And it's probably not a surprise that that happens, because prehospital triage happens very early, i.e. at the start of the natural history of a traumatic injury. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here with all the paramedics and ambulance service clinicians on the call that it's a difficult environment practicing prehospitally. There's limited time and information available. It's a challenging environment. You don't have access to imaging or tests. And we've seen that the American College of Surgeons have actually been working on their field triage criteria for 25, 30 years. There's been multiple iterations. There's been a lot of studies in the area, and we've seen that they're struggling to get effective and optimal sensitivity and specificity. So given these challenges, there's likely a limited percentage of accuracy that's achievable. And what we wanted to do was maximize the accuracy of the tools, that percentage that's available, that we can distribute between sensitivity and specificity, and choose the best combination of triage tool variables that are predictive for what we want to pick out, our definition of major trauma. And then secondly, get that balance between sensitivity and specificity, optimize it, and it might be different to what the American College of Surgeons have historically told us. And to do that, we performed operational and economic modelling, and we'll go through that next. So no test is perfect. There's always a trade-off between, or no triage tool is perfect. There's always a trade-off between missing major trauma cases and overwhelming the major trauma centre with unnecessary pre-alerts and bypasses. If we add variables to our triage tool or loosen the threshold, so let's say we say, okay, systolic blood pressure less than 100 as opposed to less than 90, as we do that, the sensitivity of a tool will improve, but inevitably the specificity will fall. And that optimal balance between sensitivity and specificity is a really key issue in developing the best possible triage or the most suitable triage tool. And it depends on a couple of things: the prevalence, i.e. the percentage of major trauma patients in the population we're using the triage tool, and how serious it is if we miss a major trauma patient as opposed to falsely pre-alerting or bypassing a patient. So firstly, we performed operational modelling, looking at patient flows within a trauma network to explore this. And just as a sort of theoretical example, we could say a large trauma network might convey around 1,000 injured patients per week. It's probably around about 500, but just to make the maths a little bit easier, we'll say it's 1,000. Now, within 1,000 injured patients, probably the prevalence of major trauma is around 2%. So we'd expect about 20 of those 1,000 injured patients to actually have major trauma. And because of that low number of major trauma patients, sort of a needle in a haystack, we really need to develop a highly specific triage tool. So if we look through the numbers on the screen here, as specificity is around about 95%, we'll get about 10 trauma team activations per day. But as that specificity falls, we can see that the number of trauma team activations increases very quickly and becomes unmanageable. And by the time we're down at a specificity of 74%, we'd be getting 40 trauma team activations or pre-alerts or bypasses to the MTC per day, and most of them won't have major trauma. And conversely, again, driven by that low prevalence of major trauma amongst injured patients, as sensitivity drops, sensitivity is sort of relatively less important, and as the sensitivity drops down from 75 down to 45, we're only missing, even at high sensitivity, we're only missing 0.1 major trauma cases incorrectly taken to the trauma unit. And as the sensitivity goes down, even if it goes all the way down to 45%, it's only 0.3 major trauma patients per day taken to the trauma unit. So that operational modelling shows us that high specificity, ideally 95%, is needed so that we get a workable number of patients being bypassed and pre-alerted to the major trauma centre. Sorry. We also did economic modelling, and that accounts for all the costs and patient outcomes and allows us to determine which tool or triage tool would be most cost effective for the NHS. We developed an economic model which reflects all of the possible journeys within a trauma network and reflected that major trauma centre care is more effective but more expensive than trauma units. And running this model across a range of plausible triage tool accuracies informed from those previous systematic reviews showed that we should be favouring a specific tool. And when specificity of the triage tool drops below 95%, we don't meet the NHS cost effectiveness targets. It's not just us saying that in the MATTS project. Previous research from the US has also concluded that cost effectiveness in major trauma triage is really tightly tied to triage specificity. And we can go back to those American College of Surgeons recommendations, and it's actually flipped around, and high sensitivity triage of 95% recommended by the American College of Surgeons is actually very not cost effective and not feasible, and we actually want to flip it around. So up to number 5 now. Next, it's important for us to define what population we want the triage tool to be applied to, and this underpins modeling and validation of the tools, and also is very important for when we're going to use the tool in the field. So should we apply it to every single injured patient, even if they've got a stub toe or a paper cut? Or should we apply it only to those who've had a significant mechanism of injury, for example, a high-speed RTC? Or should we only use it where we actually think there's a very, very good chance of major trauma being present? And that's debatable, and we can certainly discuss that afterwards. But we do know that in elderly patients, major trauma can occur after low energy trauma, for example, ground level falls. And we therefore defined our population where a triage tool would be used would be any patient where there's a non-trivial injury. And by trivial injury, I mean abrasions, contusions, sprains, that type of thing, superficial deliberate self-harm. But we also planned to confirm how the triage tool performed if we only applied it in higher energy or penetrating injury trauma subgroups, for example. We also defined exclusion criteria where triage tools wouldn't be used or shouldn't be used. So, for example, if there was an unmanageable airway, most trauma networks would agree that that patient should be diverted to the trauma unit so the airway could be controlled, rather than a prolonged transfer to the MTC where the patient could lose their airway on the way, for example. Other patient groups could be drowning, where there's a very, very low probability of major trauma, and it's more likely to be something like hypoxic brain injury. We also conducted a number of focus groups with ambulance service clinicians, trauma network, stakeholders around what was happening in current triage practice. And it's actually really interesting. I think Josh is going to dig into that a little bit more detail after I finished. And so triage tools are used variably, and they seem to be used more commonly by, let's say, junior or less experienced staff, which might be expected. And as staff got more experienced, they used the tools less. They would use them in selected cases only, really, if there was a little bit of uncertainty or grey area case. And actually, quite often, triage tools were used after the decision had already been made for whether to bypass or pre-alert the patient or not, and was used retrospectively to justify that decision that had already been made on clinical judgment, which was very interesting. And also, when pre-alert calls were made to the major trauma centre, quite often there was a negotiation between the major trauma centre and the pre-hospital clinician, and some sort of negotiated outcome as a result of that. And as I say, Josh will maybe discuss some of those in a little bit. So we've decided we need a new major trauma triage tool. We've defined the type of patients we want that triage tool to pick out. We've defined the population we're going to use our triage tool in, and we've defined our accuracy trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. So we're now ready to develop our new triage tool. And to do this, we used expert consensus to use which variables to use in a traditional triage tool checklist. And this entailed a Delphi survey and a series of expert consensus meetings. And I actually heard from Anna that you're going to be hearing from Rod McKenzie in a couple of weeks' time, who's going to talk through that process around the development of the tool in more detail. And that's published in the British Journal of Paramedics. However, we could say ChatGPT and AI is taking over the world. Why did we go for expert opinion when we could have used machine learning or statistical prediction models? Well, I think there's actually a very good rationale that supports that choice of going for expert consensus. So firstly, we've seen there are many, many tools out there already, and our approach allowed us to build on the best aspects of those tools already in use, and we could go for an evolution, not revolution approach. Also, paper-based checklists of variables are intuitive, they're simple to use in that challenging pre-hospital environment we've already discussed, and they were really highly favoured when we asked ambulance service clinicians in our focus groups. That checklist design's currently used by all UK ambulance services, and that reduces the risk of implementing a national tool with a similar design. And if you look in other areas of medicine, expert-derived tools actually usually outperform data-driven modelling approaches. So the HEART score would be a good example for any hospital clinicians on the call. And in contrast to all of that, statistical prediction models, machine learning algorithms, AI are complex. They need massive or really large, robust data sets to develop them. They're very opaque and less interpretable because they just spit out a sort of a yes, no at the end. They're difficult to implement into practice. And actually, we know that that approach doesn't work well in low signal to noise situations, which is exactly what we've got in major trauma triage. So the moment everyone's been waiting for, the final version of the expert consensus candidate MATTS tool is shown on the screen there. I'm going to go through this briefly now, but Josh will be covering it in more detail after my talk. So there's 3 steps: a vital signs or physiology first step, anatomical injury second step, and then a third step allowing clinical judgment supported by senior advice, which could come from a senior paramedic, a trauma desk, HEMS team. We can see, if we look at the variables, that there's a relatively tight number of variables, and they're quite specific cut points or thresholds. So we can see that we need a sustained systolic blood pressure of less than 90, for example, rather than a single one-off measure of systolic blood pressure less than 90, which is in some tools. We've got a relatively low GCS motor score, so withdrawal of pain. So if the patient's localizing to pain, or has got a GCS of 13 or 14 total, they wouldn't qualify. So this tool would definitely fall at the more specific end of the current spectrum of UK tools. Probably it would fall between the specific tools, let's say the East of England tool, and an intermediate tool such as NIAS. It would come in between those two groups. So we then took all of that tool and all of the other tools that we'd identified earlier in the project, and we validated them in the phase 2 case cohort study, which included several thousand patients and used linked ambulance and TARM data. And after excluding all of the triage tools that have worse sensitivity for any given specificity, we can construct a sort of a curve of the best performing tools as shown on the slide. And then we can compare that curve to the target trade-off between sensitivity and specificity that we wanted. And based on our targets from the operational modeling, we know that we want a tool with about 95% specificity, which is about here. And we want the tool that gives us best sensitivity for that, which actually was, thankfully, the MATTS tool, which was quite gratifying and good. So now we've identified that as the best performing tool, we can take it away and implement it into practice and see what happens in real life when it's used. But before we do that, we do need to think carefully about operationalization of the tool. So triage tools, trauma networks is actually quite a complex milieu, really, because you've got overlapping ambulance services, trauma networks served by multiple different ambulance services. There could be differences between catchment areas for specialist services related to major trauma, such as orthoplastics or burns. And there's multiple pre-hospital resources that could be involved in the care of an injured patient, HEMS, trauma desk, even private ambulance providers. So our focus groups and qualitative work has suggested that to operate effectively, the tools needed to provide some additional context and instructions beyond just a simple checklist of triage variables. So we therefore included exclusion criteria, we gave some additional injury-dependent advice, we had the option for senior clinical support, for example, from a trauma desk, and the back of the tool, shown at the top right of the slide there, has some supporting information and provides some detailed definitions from each variable, which could help inform those tricky calls to the MTC if they want to turn down a call, for example. And again, Josh will be covering some of that shortly. So the MATTS triage tool was implemented into 6 trauma networks served by Yorkshire and West Midlands Ambulance Service in 2021 in phase 3 of the project. And then we collected data on destinations, how the triage tool was used, outcomes of injured patients in those networks for the following 6 months. And we used a cohort study linking ambulance service and TARN data to evaluate that real-life triage tool performance. And we included around about 40,000 patients over those 6 months. And the prevalence of major trauma meeting our reference standard or our definition of major trauma is 2%. And as we might expect, the included patients were, on average, old, predominantly injured from ground level falls, and there were relatively fewer high energy traumas requiring emergency trauma interventions. And we can see that in real life, the observed triage decisions were very close to that target specificity of 95% and gave us a sensitivity of 55%. And there's some metrics called likelihood ratios, which are a good way of measuring how a test or triage tool is working. And what we really want is the positive likelihood ratio to be 10 or greater. And that, if it gets to that, it's a really good rule-in tool. And we actually almost got there, 9.7, and we want as close as 0.1 for the negative likelihood ratio to be a rule-out tool. So not quite so good on the negative likelihood ratio, but we did pretty well on the positive likelihood ratio. So what does that mean in real life? So if we have on the left of the screen here, this is called a Fagan's nomogram for any statisticians out there. This is the probability of major trauma when we attend a patient in the field. On average, 2% of injured patients have major trauma. So on average, 2%, there's a 2% risk of major trauma. If we apply our triage tool and it's positive, we can apply that positive likelihood ratio. And it means if the triage tool is positive, on average, there's about 16% risk of the patient having major trauma. If the triage tool is negative, we can apply that negative likelihood ratio. And on average, the triage tool is negative, there's only a 1% chance they've got major trauma. Okay, and maybe one thing also to note is in these patients who were false negatives, so the triage tool didn't trigger, or the paramedics didn't take them to major trauma center, but they actually turned out to have major trauma ultimately when they arrived at the trauma unit. That group of patients had a very, very low rate of needing urgent trauma interventions. It was less than well under 5%. So that suggests that there's a second chance for that group of patients that they could undergo secondary transfer to the major trauma center if it was needed, if that high level of care was eventually needed. Right. So as we've touched on already, triage tools could be seen as mandatory protocols. So you have to follow it to the letter. The respiratory rate is 30. I don't care if they've got COPD and there's a discharge letter saying that their normal respiratory rate is 40. They've triggered the tool. They've got to go to the MTC on one extreme. Or on the other extreme, we could say, okay, you can use the triage tool just to support your decisions subject to clinical judgment. And previous work that we looked at during phase 1 suggested that clinical judgment adds value to triage decisions. And that also came out through the focus groups we did with paramedics, particularly experienced paramedics who wanted to bring their expertise and experience to the table when making triage decisions. And that underpinned those facts underpinned the decision for the third step of unstructured clinical judgment in the MATTS triage tool. So how did that work out? Well, it actually worked out that paramedic triage decisions differed from those suggested by the tool in about 15% of cases. But when it happened, it actually added value and improved the performance of the tool, increasing sensitivity and specificity. So that's the MATTS reference standard shown there. The sensitivity and specificity, if we just followed what the tool said, is there. But when the paramedics applied their extra clinical judgment, it actually improved both the sensitivity and the specificity of the tool. And our final point in our top 10 is the NHR commissioning brief for MATTS was to develop a single national triage tool. However, we well know that major trauma is different in children's, adults, and elderly. And in fact, you could make a good case that it's a different disease in those patient groups. They each demonstrate differing mechanisms of injury patterns, physiological responses. So it was important for us to look at how the MATTS tool performed across those different subgroups. And we can see that it actually performed reasonably across all of those different subgroups. So if we look on this chart, which plots sensitivity against specificity, we've got a traffic light system here. And we want to be as close as we can to the green area, which shows high sensitivity and or specificity and gives us those good likelihood ratios. And we're in or around the really good green zone across each of the subgroups. So how do we interpret that? Well, on average, the MATTS tool does perform well. There's likely to be advantages from using a single tool operationally. For example, major trauma in children is very rare, and having a separate tool for that is, I'm sure there's a lot of checkboxes and algorithms you've got to fall. So I think we can say that we were happy that the tool performed well across the different subgroups. So in summary, we finished those 10 important major trauma triage issues. The MATTS project addressed each of them. Through that detailed preparatory work in phase 1 and ultimately developing that specific major trauma triage tool. This performed as expected when we implemented it into clinical practice, and it acts as a ruling test in low prevalence settings and reduces the probability of a missed major trauma to 1% on average if negative. It met the brief for a single test, performing reasonably well across all of those age groups. So I'll finish off there. Thanks for your attention. I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to Josh, who can cover the triage tool and some of the qualitative research findings in more detail. And I'd be delighted to take questions later. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Gordon. Lovely talk. As always, happy to move on and take you through those bits as discussed. People who've put some questions in the chat and in the Q&A section, we absolutely will come to them. So I'm going to go through at reasonable pace. I just check you can see a map on the left-hand side of the screen, hopefully. Oh, lots of thumbs up. I like that. Thank you. So we've touched on how it's not fair that patients are receiving variable triage performance around the country just because of which tool is being used. As Gordon touched on, there are also some good operational reasons not to do it. If you have a look at this map on the left here, you're looking at it thinking, goodness me, what is this a map of? It's certainly not the ambulance services of the UK. A Welsh ambulance service, Wales hasn't just shrunk. Welsh ambulance service covers that patch going into Royal Stoke Hospital there. So if you're a clinician working in Royal Stoke University Hospital, major trauma centre in the north of my region, you're receiving patients who've been triaged according to the West Midlands Ambulance Service, the MATTS tool, because plot spoiler, we've carried on using it since this study. We have used it now it's just had its 3rd birthday. So we've got patients coming to Royal Stoke from Wales, from the Welsh Ambulance Service using their tool. From North West Ambulance Service, from patients around the Leighton area feed into Royal Stoke, or they can do. Before people say, no, we don't, we go up. And also East Midlands Ambulance Service. In terms of interoperability between ambulance services, the West Midlands is actually surrounded by other services. So any of our staff or our officers, if we're working on a border area, might be working with crews from all of Welsh Ambulance Service, Northwest, East Midlands, South Central if we go down to the right, or Southwestern Ambulance Service on the Gloucestershire-Herefordshire border. So there's a lot of advantages in having one tool from that as well. And finally, as we've talked about previously, it's just not fair to not have different performances around the country. So these are the 4 tools that were in those 4 ambulance services in phase 2. So London and Southwest and West Midlands and Yorkshire. West Midlands and Yorkshire moved in to test the new tool in phase 3. The other 2 did not. So At this point, we've not changed using our tools. We're using these existing tools and collecting patient data and also collecting TARN data. Someone's put a question in the chat. So TARN is the Trauma Audit Research Network, which has been renamed since the MATTS study took place and moved departments as well. So that is capturing whether these people actually were injured when they went to hospital. So that meeting that reference standard of were these people who should have gone to a major trauma centre. So if you take a look at just the bottom left one here. So the bottom left is West Midlands Ambulance Service tool. When we moved to test the new tool, the MATTS tool, we decided that we thought we would like to actually align with that. So although ambulance services who choose to adopt the MATTS tool or perhaps have it imposed upon them, I don't know, if they choose to adopt this tool, you absolutely can adjust the layout, the formatting, the phone numbers that are on it to meet your local context. So what we have in the West Midlands looks absolutely nothing like what was produced. And I've got a screen blur on, so you can't see here, but this is a pocket card, which is pale pastel colours, not the bright colours. We decided in the West Midlands we wanted to have a very similar looking card. Yorkshire, our colleagues up in the north, took the opposite approach. They said, we're moving to a new tool. We want the tool to look different from the old one. So if you go back a couple of slides, there, top right there, they moved to a very similar to this yellow layout. So they've gone for something completely different. When the tool was introduced, was there a big training burden for those ambulance services? Not at all. So we printed locally pocket cards in a variety of formats. So we had these for staff for the combat trousers. We had for the people who wear trousers with the windows, so largely our critical care paramedics and our colleagues on the air ambulance. We made a very trimmed down small version that can be worn on your thigh pocket and visible through that window, so it's smaller. We made absolutely enormous one for our trauma desk in our control room so they could see it at a glance without having to like peer down. And we made something in the middle, sort of A4 and A3 for in hospitals, so that to avoid some of those discussions where, well, your tool doesn't say this. Well, no, your tool's pinned to the wall, so you can see that we've moved to this new approach. There was no formal training in this tool. What we did have, which I will show you now, is some supportive notes to make sure that some of those changes were really clearly well enacted. Specificity, so being strict, is important for MATTS. The tool won't work as well if you're not strict with it, if you're not using it specifically. If you're using it to capture anyone who might have major trauma, Gordon showed you the numbers, you end up with 40 patients alerted to the ED. If you have 40 patients alerted to even a huge major trauma centre in a day, that 38th, 39th patient isn't going to be getting anything like major trauma centre care, because they'll be going by then, Josh, he just brings in people without major trauma centre. He rings the red phone because he wants to go home quickly, this kind of thing. So how do we keep it strict? We have notes attached to the back of the card. So in the West Midlands, we went with black and white on the back, so you can't get confused and read the wrong side. You can see that it's colour on one side, black and white on the back for those notes. I give you a couple of examples. So this is how detailed we are. When someone falls from a roof and they stand up and they rub their side and they hurt their hip, that is not a major pelvic fracture. We've got a definition of what it is. So the mechanism of injury and the clinical findings are suggestive of it. So it might be, for example, they've fallen from the roof and they've got the pain there. But they must have any one of the clinical signs of shock, pelvis deformity or instability, severe pelvic pain, pelvic injury of PU, PR or PV bleeding, or scrotal hematoma. That GCS motor score we've listed on the back there. We know that GCS is difficult to calculate. Having a single item is easier to calculate, but even then, if you forget and you think, I can't remember what 5 is, you look there, you go, they're not responding to motor commands, they're not localizing to pain, so cause a painful stimulus C, do they localize to that site? The other final example I'll come to is the spinal injury with paralysis. So that's defined here as paraplegia, tetraplegia, or limb paralysis, not isolated paresthesia. So we've got quite a bit of detail on the back there that people could refer to, but there was no training as such, no delivered formal training. It was introduced in October 2021, and we're now 3 years down the line. We've got some of the exclusions mentioned for the reference standard down the bottom there, and I will come back to that in a moment for our qualitative work. Before I do that, I just thought, if you're listening at home and you're thinking sensitivity and specificity, it's blowing my mind, You're not alone. It took me a very long time, and Gordon was very patient with me at times, sitting and explaining why the low prevalence matters. Our mutual friend and colleague, James Baird, did some wonderful visualizations of a few things within the study, and this one really works for me, so I've put it up for you as well. Same sensitivity, 55%, same specificity, 94%. This shows you here the triangles. Triangle is trauma, so the 20 patients with major trauma out of 1,000 patients. So a major trauma network sees, say, 1,000 patients a week with any kind of non-trivial trauma. Of those, 2%, so 20, have major trauma. So only up to 20 can be correctly triaged to the major trauma centre. 980 do not have major trauma. So with those characteristics, you can see quite readily why specificity is so important, more important than sensitivity, because it's a little bit counterintuitive. You think, how is it more important, or I did, how is it more important to detect people without major trauma than those with major trauma? So we can see those numbers here. So you've got 11 correctly pre-alerted to the major trauma centre, 9 under triaged, although as Gordon touched on, they are not necessarily people needing intervention. So we talk about major trauma positive and major trauma negative. Even within those 20 patients, there are some who are very, very injured and some who are less injured, but still over that threshold. And then those dark blue squares are the over triage. So even with 94% specificity, we end up with 59 patients over triage, so being alerted to the major trauma centre, having the team of 8 people, 10 people stood around waiting for them. That's why you end up with those scores that we saw earlier of how many patients, out of 8 patients, 1 might have major trauma. So I thought that might help. Another visualization that helps me, this is the West Midlands, so apologies if you don't know the West Midlands, but I'll talk you through it. So this is our observed performance in the West Midlands region for phase 3. So these are real patient movements. To put this in context, red circle here is the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham. The other one next to it is Birmingham Children's Hospital, because our major trauma is separated in Birmingham between children and adults. Over here is the University Hospital, Coventry and Warwickshire. I was there this morning. And up here is Royal Stoke. This dot with a few patients going into it in the bottom left is Hereford. So Hereford has some patients with major trauma who were brought to them in this study. We know that some of those patients were brought to here, but equally you can see some patients from Herefordshire correctly identified by the tool and brought to Birmingham. That's about, from Leominster, it's about 55 miles from Hereford, 45, 50 miles. Over here you can see edge of Shropshire, bottom of edge of Shropshire and Herefordshire, again going into Birmingham. So quite some distances. We will come back to whoever asked about very remote locations. Quite decent distance, about an hour on blue lights. I'm going to show you the next slide where we add in all the patients who did not have major trauma, and you see where they go. So you see here the patients without major trauma by and large being taken to their local hospital. So you see some hospitals here where no major trauma patients were taken. You see some where a few were taken in error. But those blue lines are patients without major trauma correctly being taken to their local hospital. So to me, that really helps. And I think it's an interesting way of visualizing the large numbers of people. Most patients do not have this reference standard of major trauma. I very quickly touch on the qualitative side. So this is a quotation from one of our focus groups. Quite frankly, I'm absolutely swimming in algorithms on my ambulance. We did various points in the study. So we did before and after. These are the views from after the tool was introduced. So this is from West Midlands and Yorkshire. Firstly, a survey. We've got a broad spread of people who work and operationally see people at the scene. So a small number of people respond to this survey who are working on the trauma desk, and they answered in that role. They do also rotate, they're rotational paramedics, but we asked them to mention if they were working on that trauma desk. There are not very many people working on that desk, so that's why it's a relatively small number. By and large, people were quite happy with this tool. So you see here that the pale green is agree and strongly agree with these statements. So the statements are all positive. So easy to use, relevant and useful. Appearance of the tool is good. Makes speedy decisions, consistent decisions, has increased my confidence and makes good decisions. So by and large, broadly positive from people at scene here. This is the on-scene respondents. This is from both West Midlands and Yorkshire. So the tool was used in both places and remains used in both. Trauma desk personnel, even more so, really very positive responses. They're a smaller group of people, as I mentioned, but good responses here. They were less sure about the increasing their confidence in decisions, but to put that in perspective, these are very experienced critical care paramedics. So the chances of this tool increasing their confidence in the decisions, we possibly wouldn't expect that. In the qualitative, in the focus group, more descriptive side of things, they do reflect on having agreed criteria and how helpful that is in these sometimes terse discussions with hospitals. I'm going to touch on the exclusion. So this is agreeing with exclusion. So on-scene providers, first of all, a degree of perhaps uncertainty, and I will take on the chin as one of the research team at West Midlands. Perhaps we did not explain these exclusions as clearly as we ought to have. So the first three: severe frailty, advanced directed and palliative end of life care. The reason those patients are excluded from the major trauma centre bypass, taking someone 55 miles to their major trauma centre care, probably is not in their best interests if they are already at a state where they're unlikely to be offered additional treatments from the major trauma centre that would not be provided locally at their local hospital. We're not saying they shouldn't go to hospital. We're not saying they might not go to the MTC, but we're saying as a default, if you've got these characteristics, probably being driven an hour away from your family and away from your local hospital when you're unlikely to be offered those additional treatments at that MTC is not in your interests. Severe frailty is a high bar. We'll come back to that in a minute. Hangings and drownings, as Gordon mentioned, is related to clinically that they're unlikely to be major trauma needing those specific trauma interventions. Trauma desk personnel were a bit clearer on the rationale for this, again, probably reflecting their experience and their training. So they were a bit happier with these exclusions. So I'll come back to this. So the cutoff for the exclusion of frailty is severe frailty, a CFS of 7, so living with severe frailty. These are people who are completely dependent for personal care from whatever cause, physical or cognitive. Now, there's a couple of things. One is that this is not saying these people never will go to the MTC. It's not saying they can't have the support of MTC advice remotely, which does happen. And it's not saying that you might occasionally have patients that go, but it's not a default that these people should automatically now be going to MTC if they have a criteria, an injury that meets those criteria. Okay, with some focus groups as well, a decent spread. Again, the trauma desk one a little smaller, but there's very few people for those trauma desk people to come from. We've got a good mix from West Midlands and Yorkshire. We've got a range of experiences from very experienced to not so experienced. And we also had a good number of ED staff as well. I'm going to share 3 slides of these quotations and we'll pause and come back for discussions and questions. So the first person, on-scene pre-hospital provider, saying, for me, the tool really helps in comparison because of all the clarifications. That, for me, has made it really useful and cut and dried for the most part. So I think a lot of us who work in pre-hospital setting, we like clarity and we like to avoid uncertainty where possible. There's already enough uncertainty, as Gordon said, about what has happened to the patient, what injuries they sustained. We don't want unclarity about which injuries, if they have sustained them, are those that will render them for this direction versus that direction. The second one, the research team are good at engaging with internal stakeholders. So we knew something was coming. We had a lot of questions pushed out. I'll flip that on its head. I'm going to say thank you to everyone at both trusts who engaged so early in the process. The trauma desk had probably the highest burden of changing completely. They're providing support remotely to staff. Changing overnight on a Monday morning from one to the other, and they really engaged with it from the get-go. So thank you to everyone for that. So that's a good. A couple of more troublesome aspects. So the first one is a pre-hospital provider saying, our local A&E will often challenge crews and bring in trauma patients and so on. So a lot of paramedics will use it just to tick the box, so you don't get the flack from the nurses at handover. This isn't not an unusual saying. We've got a lot more work with the qualitative side of things will be published with the rest of the study. It's very difficult to present qualitative work quickly, so do come back and enjoy that when the study's published. And secondly, this, quite frankly, I'm absolutely swimming in algorithms, which is partly why I probably don't use them as much as I should. And that's okay. So we've said that clinician judgment, a couple of you have commented in the chat, clinician judgment improving things. That's absolutely what we saw. The theoretical result was this, and the pre-hospital judgment, paramedic judgment being applied, improved performance in phase 3 when we put this out there. Paramedics and ambulance clinicians, ambulance technicians did improve the accuracy. Finally, there was a couple of differences between the two trusts, so quite a different culture between the two at the time this was done. This is 2021 that the tool was brought in, October 2021, so it may have changed now. So we're encouraged to ring the trauma desk. You probably get in trouble if you haven't, if you've got quite a serious job and you haven't rung them. Even within West Midlands, this is slightly cultural by area, but by and large, if we have a major trauma centre bypass in the West Midlands, we ring pass ATMIS to the trauma desk, and they ring the major trauma centre and say, this crew is coming to you. As a crew, we do not speak to the receiving hospital. That's done by the trauma desk. That differs around the country, and you should bear that in mind when you're thinking about implementing this and bringing in these results. There's also remote support from trauma desk critical care paramedics available at both sites, which differs around the country in terms of availability, but yeah, remote support was used at both sites for supporting these decisions. A second person, so from Yorkshire, kind of took the opposite approach. So they're saying, they're an experienced person, bit naughty of them, they'll ring the hospital rather than using the tool. So having a discussion with those, or using the trauma coordinator. So there is a little bit of difference in approach there. We can chat about that afterwards. So that's me done with our experiences in the West Midlands. We'll very happily take some questions. I'm going to pause for a second there and have a quick look at those. And I think I was going to say, I think we have our lovely hostess.
Hello.
Hello.
We just get, as usual, folks, the awkward bit where I just try and find my keynotes again. There they are. Wonderful. And everyone can see that. And let me just make this bigger. And then I can get the questions up as well, because they have been flooding in, which is good. It means it's an interesting topic. It means people want to learn more. So before we move on to the Q&A, I just want to draw attention to our next webinar. Yes, he's back again. Mr. Kid Confident himself, James Nair, is returning to us, also straight off the back of the conference, on April the 3rd, so in 2 weeks' time. He will be with us to talk about effective management of paediatric patients. I was chatting to him at the conference about this, and he's basically going to be talking about pain relief in paediatric patients, and sort of breaking the taboo and talking about everyone's favorite adage of, pediatrics are just small adults, and how we can collectively grown at that sort of stuff, and how we actually should manage pediatric patients and their pain relief. So do scan the QR code now. James's webinars are always incredibly popular, so scan the QR code now, and then hopefully you'll be there. Wonderful. So that Q&A section, if you are not, I'm going to reiterate, not a member of Trauma Care, scan the QR code that's on your screen now, and it'll take you through to a type form. It takes less than a second to fill out, and you can purchase your CPD certificate. If you are a member of Trauma Care, hang fire. I will be sending your certificates first thing in the morning. I'll leave that up, and we shall move on to the questions. So I know that quite a few came into the chat, so excuse me as I lean forward because my glasses are somewhere around me. And a discussion happened as well. So we'll go right back to, well, actually, Kath, who asked this, isn't in, but I think it's an interesting point that she made. And I know we briefly touched upon it, but this is a chance to expand. So Kath Livingston did put, I work in remote and rural hospitals where bypassing is not an option, and all seriously injured patients will be transferred, not just major trauma. In these circumstances, are a role for a major trauma triage tool? And if so, what? And does there need to be one developed specifically for rural locations?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So great question. And I think we try to emphasize throughout the talk that major trauma triage is complex, it's difficult. It's a difficult environment to work in, and there's multiple different setups, models of trauma networks. Now, and following on from that, to try and help with the operationalization of the tool and help implementation of the tool, we gave additional caveats, instructions, supporting information. Actually, one of the ones that we didn't highlight is on the instructions. In fact, I might be able to share my screen and bring it up, is that we excluded patients who had a transport time of greater than an hour to the MTC. They were out. That was one of the exclusion criteria for using the major trauma triage tool. Now, the trauma networks that we implemented and evaluated the triage tool in don't really fit that bill of prolonged pre-hospital transportation. The West Midlands is, although it has got, is a relatively tight
I'm just
network.
looking at the card. We've taken it off, and I think I took it
Okay.
off because I said there is nowhere more than an hour. It's so close to an hour. It's an hour and 10.
Exactly, and the same in Yorkshire as well. So we haven't got direct evidence or data or experience of implementation within a trauma network where that may be the setup, but it was certainly something that we considered and we put it in as an exclusion criteria. And I think that's fairly standard. I suppose the other thing that we could say, I think I think I saw East of England trauma network representative on, and in circumstances where there are prolonged pre-hospital transport times, I think quite often the service has evolved and there might be a big role for HEMS, basics, pre-hospital teams in those areas. And it may mean that trauma units have to be sort of a little bit upskilled because they're going to be receiving seriously injured patients. So hopefully that's answered the question, but it's an important and valid point.
Perfect. And oh, hello, Phil. Lovely to see you here as well. There's so many familiar names after last week as well. So I saw Tim Coates, our chairperson, in as well tonight, which is absolutely wonderful. So Phil has asked, as always, an interesting point from Mr. Coburn. So interesting that the respiratory rate of 29 is higher than the MPTT minus 24 triage tool for major incident when the inflection point from TARN data was 24, given it was almost the same data cohort. Or is it better to align to the JR Calc normal values?
Yeah, so you can, there's multiple different ways that you can decide on the cut point. So you can do it based on expert opinion. You can do it based on fitting statistical models, modeling. And if you look across most major trauma triage tools, that 29 is the cut point that most major trauma triage tools use, which may differ from mass casualty or other tools or clinical decision support tools. One thing that we are going to do, so we've got a whole raft of secondary analyses that are going to be coming through, and one thing that we are going to be looking at is the inflection points and the modeling. I've got to say, interestingly, in our data for major trauma, it's not published, but just from exploratory analyses, it actually was probably the least predictive of those vital sign predictors, and it didn't actually show that inflection. It didn't show an inflection at 24, and it was moderately predictive compared to other predictive variables. But that is something that we will be looking at, and yeah, keep your eyes peeled. It should hopefully be in the next year or so, we'll be analysing and publishing that.
Wonderful. Oh, sorry, someone's just asked a question for us, so I've just popped it in the chat. So there's a lot of discussion going on, which is always good. I love a lively discussion and people sharing the knowledge and getting sort of chatting to each other about this stuff. So I think there's no more questions really in the chat, unless I know, Josh, you were sort of going through stuff. So if you find something, you let me know. Let me just...
Quite a few in the Q&A.
Yes, of course. So we'll start from the top, from the anonymous attendees. So yes, okay, perfect. Which E-squared tests have explored to compare expected and observed trauma care confirmed patients?
Yeah, I might have got the wrong end of the stick of the question, but we did compare the theoretical tool outcome and the actual observed decision outcome, and statistically analyze that, and there was a statistically significant difference in that about 15%. There's about 15% of triage decisions that differed from what the tool actually objectively told you to do. I may have misinterpreted the question. If so, please drop me an email and I'll be delighted to answer that offline.
Perfect. And again, anonymous attendees, we get quite a few anonymous attendees joining us on these evenings. Great talk. Could you clarify for the that is a tongue twister of a word, statisticians amongst us, what you mean reduced to 1% if negative?
Yeah, so firstly, it's a tricky talk to deliver because it is stats heavy and it's difficult to get away from that. And I'm glad and thankful to Josh that he's shown those pictorial representations of the sensitivity and specificity to help and aid with understanding. So by that, I mean, if there's across all injured patients within a trauma network or an ambulance service, about 2% of them will have major trauma. So then, therefore, on average, if you're attending any given injured patient, there's a 2% probability or risk or chance that they've got major trauma. If we apply the MATTS tool to that patient and it's negative, then after they've had a negative triage tool result, then there's only a 1% chance that that patient will have major trauma. So 99 out of 100 similar patients won't have major trauma. Now, we do have to be a little bit careful about that because that's talking about on average. And if you go to the side of the road and it's a high-speed RTC with a patient who's entrapped and requires extrication and they've been in the stuck in the car and they were non-restrained and there's a bullseye on the window, then obviously there's more than a 2% chance that that patient's got major trauma. But you can work out the stats from the MATTS tool, which will all be in the publications that are coming. And even for a patient that's got a high pre-test probability of major trauma, let's say they've got a 25% chance of having major trauma. If the triage tool is negative, it will still bring you down to 1 or 2% chance that they've got major trauma. Yeah.
Perfect.
But I do apologise because there's a lot of stats in there and it's difficult to get away from that.
Well, as Josh said, so many algorithms and stats and everything being looked at for this, but that's what you have to look at to get these tools correct before you can roll them out. You can't do anything without data, and I'm in marketing. It's exactly the same over this side as well. So, anonymous attendee, does this have any alignment to News 2 for continuity in data?
Yeah, so good question. There's obviously a big push to bring News 2 score out across multiple areas. Certainly in the emergency department it's used, and definitely it was primarily designed to detect deteriorating inpatients in the hospital, but there's a move through NICE to implement it in emergency departments and I guess earlier in pre-hospital care as well. So it doesn't directly align. So News 2 score has got pulse rate, respiratory rate, level of consciousness, blood pressure and temperature, I think, are the 5 variables. The MATTS tool has got respiratory rate, blood pressure, and a sort of level of consciousness with the Glasgow motor score. It would be interesting to see how News 2 performs just generally. I guess it's not going to be great because it's primarily been designed for inpatient surgical and medical patients. But do you know what? I will add it to the list of things for us to look at, and I will credit anonymous attendee in the acknowledgement sections of the paper for their inspiration.
Lovely. And Phil again, Mr. Cowburn, do you think major pelvic fracture and open depressed skull fracture are overdiagnosed or difficult to diagnose?
Yeah, so good, very good question. So and actually that's the driving force behind having those definitions. So for example, if you go back to some of the older or other triage tools have things like boggy swelling or pelvic binder, and these things are very much overdiagnosed, and we saw in phase 2 when we looked at how individual predictors performed, those ones were being overused and weren't very effective. And the reason we went for major pelvic fracture and using the definition is to tighten it up and avoid overdiagnosis. Again, it's something that we can go and have a look at, or we will be looking at, is how each of the individual predictors within the triage tool performed and which ones, which are the best predictors, which are the worst. I think major pelvic fracture, if it's applied according to that fairly strict definition, will be very predictive of major trauma, but you are going to miss some pelvic fractures because it has got a high bar there. Skull fracture is an interesting one. That was probably the variable that was discussed the most during the triage tool development. for that very reason, is it easy to diagnose a depressed skull fracture pre-hospitally? No, not really. Unless there's an obvious deformity, it's going to be very difficult.
Perfect, thank you. And I will say, guys, there's only 4 questions left, and anything else that comes in after that we won't be able to do, because I'm very aware that it is 9:15 and people have homes to go back to, or chairs to turn around and go back into the living room. So anonymous again, another anonymous attendee. Do you think shock index will be superior to pure systolic BP in the future, particularly as EPCR theoretically can calculate immediately?
Yeah, great, a good question. One that was looked at, discussed by the expert panel, but we went for systolic blood pressure based on simplicity. So shock index, pulse rate divided by systolic blood pressure. It's been studied quite extensively. There's a lot of papers out there. I think there's probably a small marginal gain with shock index because you're using a little bit of extra information. But again, it's something on our list that we're going to be validating the shock index within the in our secondary analyses. I suspect there'll probably be a very small marginal gain, but perhaps you'll lose the benefits of that in that you've got to calculate it. It's a little bit more complex. People are less familiar with it. So yeah, there was one question that I did see that then got taken off was around using clinical judgment and the risk of using that when you've come up against governance structures if something goes wrong. And I thought actually that was a really great question. I don't know if it's been withdrawn or it was in the chat.
It's not in the Q&A bit.
Yeah, I
however,
did read it.
someone has asked for your contact details.
Yeah, maybe it got withdrawn because I definitely did see that, and I thought that was a really, really good question. And definitely because I'm one of my management roles in my emergency departments is as a clinical governance lead. So if you're going off-piste, it is a risk. So let's say the triage tool triggers and they're hypotensive, tachypneic, and they've got a couple of long bone fractures. If you don't follow the triage tool in those circumstances where it's they're triggering one a lot and it sounds and looks very much like major trauma, then yeah, I think you're on sticky ground. But a lot of the cases there's a bit of uncertainty there. You know, they might have had one transient dip in blood pressure, or it's a bit unclear, the clinical examination. And I think we've shown, and it's been shown previously, that paramedic ambulance service clinician judgment, if it's an experienced and expert clinician, does add value. And that has been shown in other patient areas as well. But I would just caution, if you are going to go off-piste, that it needs to have a sensible rationale behind it that stands up to scrutiny, and it's documented the rationale for why you did that in the notes. And I think if you did that, it would be very unfair for a governance or medical quality person to pull you up on it. But the higher risk the situation is, the more you're going off-piste, the more careful that you need to be, I would say.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And Professor Coates, hello, Tim, has asked which way around is best, clinical judgment and add in the tool, or use the tool and then add in clinical judgment?
Yeah, so
doesn't it matter?
Yeah, that's great. Really good question. So we haven't, how the tool is structured is you attend the patient, you do your clinical assessment, you apply step 1, you apply step 2, and then you apply 3 after it. So I think that would be a sensible way of doing it in terms of your workflow and sequencing it in clinical practice. But the qualitative work and talking to ambulance service clinicians, basic doctors, HEMS doctors, I think things are a little bit more complex than that. So if you turn up to the scene of an injury, of an incident, and you see that the patient's tachycardic, poor peripheries, looks pale, has a distended abdomen that's got bruises on it, probably your clinical judgment that as soon as you've walked in and seen that patient, you're going to say that that patient's got major trauma and I'm taken to the major trauma centre. But you know what? They wouldn't trigger on the MATTS tool because it doesn't include pulse rate. It doesn't include pallor or cool peripheries. It doesn't include abdominal signs or symptoms. So I would say, for me, a logical workflow sequence would be do your assessment, apply the tool, see what the result is, and then apply clinical judgment after it. But that could be open to debate, and I'd actually be very interested in what Professor Coates' thoughts are on that. I'll have to ask him next time we catch up.
Yeah, perfect. And an anonymous attendee again might be a short, quick answer for this one. Is the triage tool performant in major incidents?
No, it's not. So
not.
that's actually, again, one of the exclusion criteria is that we didn't go into the granular details of. And actually, it would be a great trauma care webinar, 10-second triage, which is another NHR funded study looking at mass incident triage. So
Mr.
yeah, you
Coben.
can put that on the list, Anna, to do. It would be a very interesting one.
Yes, I think we did one a while ago. I don't know if it was with Phil actually or not, but we've definitely done a TST one, but it's always worth revisiting because it's always relevant. So
Yes.
I'm staring at your name here, Phil, and I will email you soon about doing that. And finally for this evening, Simon Toppin has asked, when will this be rolled out standard across all ambulance trusts, or do you not know?
Yeah, so it's not really up to us. I suppose we've done the research, we've been asked to do the research, we've done the research, and we've presented it to the powers that be and the important stakeholders, and the ball's in their court. So I think the decision will really come when the next iteration of the NICE major trauma service delivery guidelines comes out. And that's not too far away. It should be in the next year or two, or certainly within the next few years. And as part of those national guidelines, they'll appraise and review all of the existing evidence. They'll look at the major trauma, the literature and research studies that have come out around major trauma triage, and then they'll make a recommendation. And hopefully they'll have a look at the 100,000-page report that I unfortunately had to submit on this, and the papers that we published, and we'll decide that, yeah, this is a good tool that will work well for the NHS and make a recommendation that it's used. But do you know what? There's been a lot of other research that's been going on and is going on. That Dutch group I've mentioned, they developed their triage tool. So I'm sure that panel will look at that. And then as things get rolled out, it would likely come through someone like Rob Bentley, who's the National Clinical Director for Major Trauma, to make that recommendation.
Yeah, and Rob's again another fantastic contact of ours, and I'm sure we could start sort of looking at this and getting updates from you guys in the future, and possibly bringing in everyone else that's involved as well. So absolutely incredible. And that is unfortunately all we have time for in terms of the Q&A. So before I log off for the evening and say goodbye to you all, just a huge thank you, Gordon and Josh. We've the chat's been so engaged tonight, which is always a wonderful sign, and a sign of an absolutely incredible presentation. So thank you so much for creating a lively discussion, wonderful questions, and a very informative presentation. And of course, thank you to our sponsors. I'm going to go through these guys. If you scan the QR code that's on your screen now, and if you were there last week, you'll have seen Toby and Nigel and all the gang at QualSafe down on the stand right in front of the stairs, up giving some talks, or even in the first aid room when they were doing their stream. So do scan the QR code that's on your screen now and find out more about how they empower you through education. And Gordon, thank you for popping your email in the chat there. And our brand new wonderful sponsors from all the way from, I think they're in Oregon. So I'm going to say Oregon. So yeah, Oregon in America, TCAR and PCAR. They do basically online courses, not webinars, but online courses about education programs for nursing and pediatric, and specifically pediatric nursing as well. So if you happen to be specializing in pediatric nursing, do scan the QR code that's on your screen now. Some of it's American standard, so some of it's not relevant to us, but they do have some British standard courses available as online as well. And of course, the ever faithful Galen. You probably saw Jay bobbing around the conference last week. Can't say too much about them because I'm not allowed to, just because of what they deal with in pharmaceuticals, not because they are the MI5. So do scan the QR code that's on your screen now and find out more about these guys as well. And finally, thank you to you all for joining us this evening. It's great to see some familiar faces, some new names, and of course, Gordon and Josh for joining us and taking time out of your evenings to be with us this evening. So wherever you are in the world, take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones. I will stop sharing my screen, and good night all.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great evening.